Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, a couple of the most disappointing players of the season for the Wolves. Jordan McLaughlin and Jaylen Noel. Both their contract statuses are somewhat in question heading to next year. Will they be back? What did their seasons look like? Why were they so disappointing? Also, another unrestricted free agent, Austin Rivers. We're going to break it all down on the show here today. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome into the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Happy Friday, everybody. Happy weekend. And a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every single day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, wherever you listen to podcasts. You can find this show also, Locked On Wolves, along with all the other Minnesota podcasts, is now available on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV as part of Locked On Sports Minnesota. More great local sports coverage 24/7 for free. Download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and also at my account, which is at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. All right, today talking about a couple disappointing players from the season. Jordan McLaughlin, Jaylen Noel. We'll also talk Austin Rivers as we continue our player review series. We'll talk a little later in the show about what the upcoming schedule looks like, which players we'll be talking about each day. Of course, we're still daily, Monday through Friday. So we'll be back again on Monday of next week. All right, let's start with Jaylen Noel. Let's start with Jaylen Noel. So we've basically been taking the roster from the minutes played. I essentially sorted it by minutes played. We're working from bottom from our way up, taking a couple liberties here because Mike Conley I'm going to include in the starter section instead of now, which is where he would be since he didn't join the team till the trade deadline. So we're going to talk McLaughlin, Rivers, Noel today. Let's actually start with Jordan McLaughlin. I think that let's start there. So last offseason, the Timberwolves actually inked Jordan McLaughlin to a very reasonable contract to bring him back as I guess this was 2 off seasons ago, to bring him back as the Timberwolves at the time, what they thought would be their third point guard. He only made $2.1 million this year, and he was fantastic at the end of last season. Remember, he even played in the playoffs over D'Angelo Russell in Game 6, more because of D'Angelo Russell's play, I think, than Jordan McLaughlin. But McLaughlin played really well at the end of last season. The start of this season, preseason, October, the first part of November, Jordan McLaughlin was fantastic. And at the time, I remember saying on the show, not ironically, meant this 100%, that he was one of the best looking backup point guards in the entire league. I just didn't think that there were any other at this point. Tyus Jones when he's in his true backup role, I guess. But McLaughlin, I think the best way to describe him when he's right is like a light version of Tyus Jones, right? The high assist, low turnover, shoots when he needs to, but isn't super ball dominant in any way. And it just kind of he fills his role, is the captain of the bench, can run your offense, etc. Go back to the first part of the season. McLaughlin had a stretch where he had at least 3 assists in a game. And what was it? I think it was 9 consecutive games. He had at least 3 assists off the bench. He also, right before he initially injured his calf in late November, this is right before Thanksgiving, the Wolves went on that 5-game winning streak. McLaughlin, in the last game of that winning streak, put up 12 points, made 4 3-pointers against Miami. Remember, it was that road trip where the Wolves got lucky with some teams missing guys, like they played at Cleveland. It had guys out. Then they won at Orlando. They won at Philadelphia with a bunch of Sixers players out. Then they came home and beat Miami, and McLaughlin was good in all of those games. He had 9 points at Orlando. He had 12, 3, and 2 steals, including those 4 made threes against Miami. And then I believe that's the game when he actually injured his calf, and he missed the next 5. Then he came back, played 3 games, re-injured his calf again, and this is December 9th. So he actually came back right after Towns got injured at the end of November, played 3 games, re-injured his calf. We didn't see McLaughlin again until February. So he missed all of December, basically, all of January, came back on February 5th against Denver, and he was not the same the rest of the season. Remember what I said about those 3 or more assists in those consecutive games? Other than his last couple games of the season, when it finally, the regular season, when it started to look like he was, rounding into form, there just wasn't any stretch of consistency for McLaughlin. In fact, he hasn't scored double figures in a game since before the calf injury. He did it a couple times early in the season, did not do it late in the season at all. He only made more than 1 3 in a game one time post calf injury. One time. And again, like, you're not looking for Jordan McLaughlin to volume score off the bench, but he has to win his minutes. And maybe I think also part of this, like, I do think McLaughlin struggled post calf injury. I don't think there's any question, but there's a stark contrast between Conley and McLaughlin when McLaughlin's not going well. When D'Angelo Russell was not going well, McLaughlin was the steady in hand who wasn't going to overshoot, who wasn't going to call his own number too much, who was going to run the offense at the right pace, push the ball like Chris Finch wants him to. Mike Conley did all of those things as well. So when Conley was on the bench, if McLaughlin wasn't playing well, the contrast, in my opinion, was more stark than when he was filling in for D'Angelo Russell. But at any rate, the most alarming thing for me with Jordan McLaughlin is that his 3-point percentage has dropped every year he's been in the league, and his volume hasn't dropped significantly either. It stayed roughly the same. Like, as a rookie, McLaughlin attempted 76 threes. He shot 38%. Second season, he shot 92 threes. He shot 36%. Last year, he shot 85 threes. He only shot 31.8% on threes. This year, he was 78 threes, almost exact number, 2 more than he shot as a rookie when he was 38% for 3, 30.8% this season. He's seen his 3-point percentage drop multiple points every season. This last year, he went from 31.8 to 30.8. That is a huge deal for Jordan McLaughlin because he doesn't really score in any other way. He doesn't get to the free throw line. Almost half of his shot attempts are coming from 3. He's about 44% for his career coming from 3. Percentage of his attempts, not overall percentage, obviously. He's undersized. Like, he's a solid defender for his size. Don't get me wrong. Jordan McLaughlin is a good defensive player, but he's still 6 foot, sub 6 foot. And then layer on top of that, this year, he saw his turnover rate climb to a career high 17.7%. Last year, it was under 15%. So it climbed nearly 3 points this year, which is huge. He saw his steal rate drop to his lowest number of his career, second worst assist rate of his career, the worst rebound rate since his rookie season. Many of his numbers dropped across the board. And if he's turning the ball over and not making open threes, he's just not a beneficial player to have in your rotation. Because, again, layer in the fact that he's undersized. He's not going to help you on the glass. He's not going to help you in passing lanes necessarily. He does because he's got a good steal rate because he's an intelligent player and he's got great hands. But there's a ceiling to what he's able to do because of that size. So, again, if he's turning the ball over at a career high rate, which he did, if he's shooting the ball at a career worst rate from outside the arc, which he did, there's not a whole lot of value to Jordan McLaughlin on the floor. And I hate saying that because I think he can be really good. And I really like Jordan McLaughlin. He's a great story, 4-year college player, spending a year in the G League, multiple two-way contracts after he's not signed in restricted free agency, ends up coming back to Minnesota on a multi-year deal. But I think it's a spot the Wolves need to upgrade. Now, back to the contract situation. I addressed this. I can't remember if it was late last week or early this week when I was kind of I think it was maybe last Friday's show, kind of recapping the roster and where it stands from a salary perspective. Well, Jordan McLaughlin has a pretty interesting deal for next year. He has a number that is non-guaranteed. It becomes guaranteed on June 30th. So the Wolves could opt to not bring him back and he just make him a free agent right around the NBA draft and he's gone. He could be an unrestricted free agent. Or they could bring him back at $2.32 million. That's a really reasonable number. Even for a third string point guard, that's not much over what the NBA minimum would be, the veterans minimum. So I actually think he'll be back because $2.3 million is basically nothing when it comes to cap space. You need point guards. If he goes, the Wolves have none, assuming they keep Mike Conley. He's also got an option around that time. I think the Wolves would keep him. So you're down to one point guard then. You have to fill that role anyway. He's the type of player you're looking for. The best version of Jordan McLaughlin makes a ton of sense for this team. Somebody who can keep the steady hand like Conley does, knock down open threes at least a league average clip, play solid defense. McLaughlin still makes a lot of sense if he's right. So I think the Wolves pick his option up, or I'm sorry, I don't think the Wolves would waive him before it becomes guaranteed on June 30th is probably the right way to say that. So that's not quite 2 months from now. I tend to think he'll be back. I also think the Wolves will add another point guard. They only have a second round pick this season, so maybe it's unlikely you draft somebody in the second round and assume that they're going to challenge for the backup point guard spot, but they might. Or they might pick somebody up in free agency. I mean, like Emmanuel Mudiay was on the G League team this year for the Wolves. I don't think he's probably a realistic option, but you could find a guy like that who's got NBA experience that could at least push McLaughlin in training camp. And again, because the contract becomes guaranteed in June, I don't know that the Wolves would waive him and eat the $2.3 million, but they could push him to third string if they have somebody that could come in and challenge for those minutes. Or the Wolves could simply kind of shift roles. They could bring back Austin Rivers and say, hey, Austin, you're competing for backup point guard minutes. I think that's unlikely. I don't like Rivers at point guard. But all I'm saying is I think Tim Connolly, the Wolves front office, Chris Finch, and the Wolves coaching staff will look for an alternative to push McLaughlin to third string and more of a in case of emergency type point guard, or at least have a contingency plan if McLaughlin doesn't look right at the start of next season either. But again, at $2.3 million, I would pretty much expect him to be back. It's not a slam dunk because the Wolves could just say, all right, this was bad. Like he was bad in the playoffs. He was bad after the injury because he was like, that's the easiest way to say it. But I tend to think he'll be back. Just don't be surprised if the Wolves bring in some additional competition. And I think they should because frankly, they need more out of that point guard, that backup point guard spot than what McLaughlin provided this season. Okay, let's move on and talk about Jaylen Noel next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our title sponsors over at eBay Motors. For a championship team, it's all about making sure every player is a perfect fit. It's the same when it comes to your vehicle. Every part needs to fit just right. So the next time you need parts and accessories, head to ebaymotors.com. With eBay Guaranteed Fit, you can be sure every part you need fits right the first time around. Just add your ride to My Garage and look for the green check to know that the part will fit or your money back. Because just like in sports, confidence is the name of the game when you shop on eBay Motors. And with over 122 million parts to choose from, you'll be back in the game in no time. After all, it's easy to bring home a win when the right parts are guaranteed. Get the right parts, the right fit, and the right prices on ebaymotors.com. Let's ride. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. Thanks once again for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. A reminder, everydayers, tomorrow on the show, well, no, not tomorrow, Monday on the show, we're going to keep going through the roster review series. We're going to talk Taurean Prince and Naz Reid. A pair of Reid is an unrestricted free agent. Prince has an option for next year. A pair of potential free agents. We'll unpack their seasons and their future outlook on Monday. We'll do a half show on each of them. And then Tuesday, we'll flip into full shows. We'll go through the starting lineup. We'll do Mike Conley Tuesday, and then we'll kind of work our way up in terms of minutes played. Although I pushed Towns to the end because I still consider Towns and Edwards the two biggest conversations. We'll hold back on them probably till the following week because we got to get through the rest of the starting lineup. And Kyle Anderson, in my mind, I mean, he's essentially a starter at this point because of how many games he did start. So those six guys that are left will come after Prince and Reid on Monday. All right, let's talk Jaylen Noel. So Jaylen Noel is maybe certainly the most frustrating case of anybody this season. I did basically a whole show back in the fall making the case for Jaylen Noel as a potential sixth man of the year candidate. I didn't think he'd win it. I thought he'd get some votes. I thought he'd be really good. And I'm not going to go through all the reasons why, but the cliff notes are Jaylen Noel was really good last season in 21 and 22. No matter how you slice it, he was an effective bench guy for the Wolves. He shot 39% from three. He had a 20% assist rate. He didn't turn the ball over. He got to the line pretty frequently and made his free throws 78% when he got there. Like, there was a lot to like about Jaylen Noel's game. He even ran some backup point for the Wolves in 21-22 with some success. And the way I've always described him on the show is his playing style is kind of a mix between D'Angelo Russell and Anthony Edwards. And again, it's a mix. It's obviously a light version of those guys, right? He's more athletic than D'Lo. He's better at getting to the rim than D'Lo, but he's got the mid-range ability. He's shoot first, but is a good passer. Not quite as good of a passer as D'Lo, but that sort of thing. With Ant, he's got a nose for getting to the rim, a nose for getting buckets, like Anthony Edwards. He's obviously not as athletic as Anthony Edwards, and he's not as big as Anthony Edwards, but he's a two that could also run some run some point. So there's kind of a cross there between those guys. And I thought he was a really good bench fit for the Wolves. And he was really good at 21-22. I'm not backing down from that at all. And that's primarily why I thought he'd be really good this year in a bigger role. And Chris Finch talked him up last summer too about like, hey, let's give Jaylen Noel becomes a rotation player. He's important for us moving forward in the wake of the big deals they made last summer. Finch talked about that publicly. We knew he was going to get those opportunities. And he even was mentioning him along with Towns and Edwards and McDaniels. Finch was bringing up Jaylen Noel unprompted as an important member of this rotation for this year. And then on top of that, something else I talked about extensively on the show, the Timberwolves' best two-man lineup last season in 21-22 was Jaylen Noel and Karl-Anthony Towns. Like those guys played really well together. So in my mind, this is Towns and Gobert starters. You stagger your rotation. Noel plays a ton of his minutes with Towns at the 5, and you run Noel Towns pick and rolls, constantly pick and pops, and you're getting Noel buckets going to the rim, or you're getting, Towns with kick out 3-pointers with Noel running the offense. Like that was my vision for this year. That did not happen. Now, Towns' injury certainly had something to do with it, but Noel just really never looked like himself, other than a couple of random games where he was just completely lights out, as Noel is capable of doing. This was not a good season for Jaylen Noel. The defense continued to be poor. That was his biggest problem. It has been his biggest problem at the NBA level. And it was bad this year. It was arguably worse than it was last season. But they knew he wasn't a good defender. The idea was like, hey, if he could compete defensively, he becomes a really, really nice sixth man type player. But his 3-point percentage plummeted from 39.4% to 28.9%. That's a 10.5% drop in 3-point shooting percentage, which is basically, like, I'm going to say it's unheard of. I'm sure it's happened. I maybe could have done a season finder at Basketball Reference and pulled the exact, whether or not that's true. But find me another player, anecdote, like off the top of your head. Can you think of anybody else who's had a 10.5% drop in 3-point percentage? Yeah, the volume increased, but not a crazy amount. Like, yes, he had more opportunities. He played more minutes, but the rate didn't increase by that much. In fact, his 3-point attempt rate compared to his overall number of shots dropped, but his number of 3-point attempts per game only went up by 1, which is a pretty significant growth. But 2 years ago, he shot 3.6 a game, and he was only 33% for 3. Last year, he was 39% on 2.6 per game. This year, back to 3.6 attempts per game, 28.9% from 3. It was just a very worrying shooting performance from Noel. Now, I'm sure he felt additional pressure, thinking okay, now I'm the straw that stirs the drink on the bench. At times when McLaughlin was out, Noel was the backup point guard, and I think that probably contributed. But you layer in the fact that his assist rate dropped by almost 5%. His turnover rate grew by 1.5%, which also isn't good. So when Noel was pressed into some more of this pseudo point guard duty, and to be clear, Anthony Edwards ran the offense of the second unit quite a bit. Austin Rivers had his turn doing that. Kyle Anderson did a lot of it. But Noel was, supposed to be the de facto point guard with McLaughlin out. And again, assist rate dropping exactly, 4.3%. Turnover rate increasing by 1.5%. And the shots not falling. Weirdly, Noel got to the rim more frequently this year. He shot more, had more shot attempts at the rim than he did last season, but his percentage went down. So he shot, last year he shot about a fifth of his shots at the rim. This year is about a quarter of his shot attempts, but his percentage at the rim went down by a little over a percentage point, and he shot less free throws. His free throw rate was down pretty significantly. And I'd have to go back and watch to see why that would be, if he just was avoiding contact and not yet finishing, if he just wasn't getting calls. But the shot selection was not quite to where it needed to be, and the shot making was simply not good. He was a actively bad player this year for the Wolves. There's really no other way around it. And the most disappointing player, more disappointing than Jordan McLaughlin. The trick with Noel is that he's an unrestricted free agent. And when I say the trick, I mean for him. I don't think he's back in a Timberwolves uniform. Somebody will take a chance on him because his 21-22 season gave him real value. There were absolutely teams that would have called last offseason to ask about him. And maybe even at the deadline, probably not because he was so bad during the season. But he was really good last year. His whatever he's getting paid, $2 million or whatever, was an absolute $1.9 million, I think, was an absolute bargain 2 years ago, or 21-22. but he completely tanked his value this year. And of course, he had the knee issue at the end of the season too, the knee tendinopathy, and was in and out of the lineup. Had a couple decent games mixed in there when he was kind of in and out in March, April. But it's like somebody's going to sign him. I'd be really surprised if anybody gave him more than a minimum type deal and just said, hey, you could be our ninth guy, prove it off the bench. But you got to make your threes when you get the chance. Like 39% from three, Jaylen Noel, like you can live with his defense. 29% from three, Jaylen Noel, you can't. You just can't. He can't be a part of your rotation if he's going to be a negative on both ends of the floor. And unfortunately, that's where we were this year with Jaylen Noel. So I would be really surprised if he's back. And if he is, it's absolutely on a minimum deal, and he wouldn't be handed a rotation spot. But again, expect him elsewhere next season. It's disappointing. And I stand by what I thought was going to happen this year based on his season last year. But unforeseen to everybody, he completely flipped and had just a really disappointing year. All right, let's close the show by talking about Austin Rivers' season. All right, Austin Rivers was signed kind of mid-late free agency last year. I think it was like the middle of July. And at the time, I praised the Timberwolves signing of Austin Rivers, not because I think Austin Rivers is like a fantastic bench piece or anything like that at this stage in his career, but because it was an extremely low-risk signing of a veteran player who'd been there, in multiple roles on multiple teams that have been to the playoffs. And a really good example, the Wolves trying to round out not even their rotation, really their bench with, I don't know, reasonable NBA talent, right? Like guys who had been there, done that, could come in, step up in a pinch and do something, beneficial to the team instead of just signing second rounders and two-way guys and just kind of like leaving it to them at the end of the bench. That was a sign to me of the Wolves being really serious in the wake of the Rudy Gobert trade. Like, hey, this is the right move, right? We could fill out the bench with guys, and also players like that want to be in Minnesota because they think the Wolves are going to be good. They're building it the right way. It was, like I said, very low risk. He signed for only $650,000 guaranteed. The deal did not become fully guaranteed to the veterans minimum until January. So Austin Rivers was never intended to be a part of the Timberwolves rotation. He was at times this season. And he ultimately played in, 60 or 52 games. And when he played heavy minutes. Like he was very rarely like come in for a couple of minutes at the end of the quarter type player. He was a member of the rotation. He averaged 19.5 minutes per game in the 52 games that he played. And he actually started 10 games as well. And there were a couple stretches this season where he was, like I said, a big part of the rotation. And again, on a partially guaranteed deal, it always made sense that he would be kind of like the 10th guy, right? And that was supposed to be his role as a two guard who could come in and play defense, kind of the last line of defense in terms of on-ball defenders after Anthony Edwards and Jaden McDaniels, obviously, even after Jordan McLaughlin at point guard at least. And then late in the season, you added in Nickeil Alexander-Walker, Mike Conley as other guys who could do on the ball what Austin Rivers could do as well. So Rivers was just kind of like, what was it? It was like late November, kind of right before the Towns injury. I think it was right around the McLaughlin injury, through when he got injured in late February. Rivers was a part of the rotation. And there were a couple blips in there where he played really well. He had a 20-point game and a win at Oklahoma City back in mid-December. In that stretch, he also had a 16-point game in the win against Dallas. He scored 21 the next night in a loss against Dallas, or the next time out. So there were still some high points. Austin Rivers could still score a little bit. And everything about his season was just kind of fine. Like he did exactly what you'd expect him to do. He was fine from outside the arc, 35%, which is a little better than what he'd been the previous year in Denver, right in line with his career average of 34.9. So he shot the three as you'd expect. He was decent defensively. I think he's, starting to show that maybe he's a half step slower defensively than what he had been earlier in his career. But also, by the way, he was a bad defender early in his career, and I thought he improved. Now we might be kind of on the back part of that, where he's starting to slow down now that he's 30. But I thought he was okay. Like I thought he held his own defensively. He did what the Wolves needed him to do. He wasn't asked to initiate a ton of offense, even with McLaughlin out. That fell more to Kyle Anderson. He was kind of, him and Jaylen Noel were like secondary initiators of the offense with the second unit behind Kyle Anderson. So if Anderson was out or injured, it would fall to Rivers and or Noel. And Rivers was primarily playing off the ball. And again, did what he needed to do, did what they asked him to do. just kind of a fine rotation guy. He still is. Like, if he came back on that exact same deal next year, I don't think I'd be too upset about that, right? Like, if you bring him in as your 10th, 11th guy, he ends up filling in for a couple dozen games because he needs to, but otherwise is a, here and there spot minutes player. That's who Austin Rivers is at this point in his career. That's who he was for the Nuggets last season. And he was valuable for them, obviously. I think that's what he could be for the Wolves again this year. I don't think the Wolves are going to go out of their way to bring him back. I mean, I don't have a great handle on what he looked like behind the scenes with the Wolves and if he's a big part of their plans in the offseason. I think it's more likely that he goes somewhere else to another playoff contender, somebody that's maybe more likely to be in a better position next year than what you might assume the Wolves will be, given how they finished this year. You could see Rivers somewhere else, but he'll be in the league. He'll be on a similar deal, probably a vet minimum deal. He's not going to get multiple years. He turns 31 before next season starts. He could be back in Minnesota, depending on how the offseason shakes out. Remember, the Wolves only have 1 second-round pick. They don't really have cap space. So it wouldn't be a huge shock to see him back in that same end-of-the-bench role next season, or to see him with another playoff contender, because I think, again, he did exactly what he's supposed to do. 3-point shooting, good enough on defense, veteran presence, could play the 2, could play the 1. That's the type of player the Wolves need to round out their, not the rotation, their bench. And so there's definitely a possibility he's back. In fact, of the 3 players we talked about today, he's certainly more likely to be back than Jaylen Noel. McLaughlin, I guess, because he is under contract if the Wolves if they don't waive him before June 30th, I think he's the most likely to be back. But Rivers has a real shot at being back on this team next season, and I wouldn't have a problem with that. All right, that's all we have for you today. We are going to continue this series next week. On Monday, we're going to talk, what did I say we're going to do Monday? Monday, we're going to talk Taurean Prince and Naz Reid, very important rotation players who, for different reasons, there's a question mark about next season. I mean, Naz is an unrestricted free agent. We'll break that down a bit further. Taurean Prince has an option next year, and I could see the Wolves, I think it's likely they pick it up, but I could also see them trading him if they do pick it up. Like, there's a lot of possibilities with both of these guys. We're going to spend a half show on each of them next week on Monday. So be sure to tune into that show. A big thank you once again for making us your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can also follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.